The Apache was worth millions of dollars, but nobody in the hangar could make it fly. The answer was not inside the newest computer system. It was waiting in the memory of a man everyone had forgotten. The morning at Red Valley Army Aviation Base began with unusual silence. Inside the massive maintenance hangar, engineers, technicians, and aviation specialists stood around an Apache helicopter surrounded by diagnostic equipment, digital displays, and inspection tools. For days, some of the most experienced experts in the unit had examined every system, reviewed every report, and studied every piece of available data. Yet the aircraft remained grounded. Captain Michael Anderson stood near the helicopter with his arms crossed, watching his team work. At 38 years old, he had built his career on discipline, preparation, and trust in modern aviation technology. He respected the people around him, but he also understood the responsibility of keeping his unit ready. Every decision mattered. Every aircraft mattered. "We have checked everything twice," one senior technician said quietly. "The systems are giving us information, but we are not finding the answer." Michael looked at the Apache sitting silently beneath the bright hangar lights. To most people, it was an incredible machine built with advanced engineering. To him, it represented the responsibility he carried for the people who depended on it. He walked around the aircraft, listening as his team explained the latest findings. Nothing appeared unusual. The digital systems showed no clear problem. The reports showed no obvious cause. The experts had experience. The technology was advanced. Yet something was still missing. Later that afternoon, Colonel David Mitchell entered the hangar and reviewed the situation. He listened carefully as Michael explained the efforts made by the technical team. "The best specialists in this unit have looked at it," Michael said. "But we are still missing something." Colonel Mitchell looked at the Apache for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised everyone. "Has anyone called Richard Hayes?" The name created a brief silence. Some of the younger technicians looked confused. They had never heard it before. A few older members of the unit exchanged quiet looks. Richard Hayes was a name from another era. A retired aviation specialist who had worked on early Apache systems decades ago. A man who had left the military years earlier and lived a quiet life away from attention. "Sir, he has been retired for a long time," one technician said. Colonel Mitchell nodded. "I know." Michael looked uncertain. He respected experience, but the idea of bringing in a 74-year-old veteran when modern experts had already failed seemed unusual. "Do you really think he can help?" Michael asked. Colonel Mitchell looked back at the Apache. "Some people understand machines because they read the data. Others understand them because they have spent years listening to them." The words stayed with Michael. He did not know Richard Hayes. He did not know the stories behind the name. All he knew was that a machine built with the newest technology had reached a point where modern solutions were not enough. As evening approached, a message was sent to an old address connected to Richard Hayes. No one knew if he would answer. No one knew if he would even come. But inside the quiet hangar, surrounded by advanced equipment and unanswered questions, the military prepared to call someone from the past. Someone who had not worn a uniform in years. Someone many believed was no longer needed. And someone who might be the only person who truly understood what the Apache was trying to say. The message reached Richard Hayes just before sunrise, arriving on a quiet morning when the 74-year-old veteran was repairing an old garden tool outside his small home. He lived far away from military bases now, surrounded by simple things that reminded him of a peaceful life after decades of service. A wooden workbench sat beside his garage, covered with carefully organized tools, many of them older than the young technicians currently working inside modern aircraft hangars. Richard had no expectations of returning to a military environment. He had spent years accepting that chapter of his life was finished. When he opened the message and saw the name Red Valley Army Aviation Base, he remained silent for several moments. It was not the first time someone had asked about his past, but it was the first time in years someone had asked for his help. The next morning, Richard arrived at the base carrying a small, worn toolbox. It was not impressive compared to the advanced equipment surrounding the Apache. It had no digital screens, no modern scanners, and no technology that matched the tools used by today's specialists. Several younger technicians noticed the old toolbox as he walked through the hangar. They were respectful, but some quietly wondered how someone who had been away from aviation for so long could help where experienced engineers had already struggled. Captain Michael Anderson greeted him near the aircraft. The commander had expected someone older, but he had not expected someone so calm. Richard looked at the Apache for a few seconds before speaking. "She has been here a while," he said. Michael looked surprised by the comment. "You can tell that already?" Richard smiled slightly. "Machines have a way of showing when something is not right. You just have to pay attention." The captain introduced him to the technical team and explained the situation. Richard listened carefully. He did not interrupt. He did not criticize the methods they had used. He simply asked questions. When did the issue begin? What conditions were present? What changed before the problem appeared? The technicians answered while showing him the reports and diagnostic information. Richard studied everything quietly. The younger specialists expected him to immediately offer an answer. Instead, he took his time. That surprised Michael. In the modern aviation world, everyone wanted quick solutions. Richard seemed more interested in understanding the entire story. After reviewing the information, Richard slowly walked around the Apache. He did not touch anything at first. He simply observed. He looked at the aircraft from different angles, listened carefully to the explanations, and noticed small details that others had overlooked. One technician watched him closely. "You really think you can find something we missed?" he asked. Richard turned toward him with a calm expression. "I think everyone here has been looking. Sometimes the answer appears when you look differently." The words were simple, but they changed the atmosphere inside the hangar. Captain Anderson watched the old veteran carefully. He still had questions. He still trusted his specialists. But he also recognized something unusual. Richard Hayes was not acting like someone trying to prove he was better than everyone else. He was acting like someone who respected the machine, respected the people around him, and understood that every problem had a story. As the afternoon light entered through the hangar doors, Richard finally stopped beside one section of the Apache and listened quietly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he looked back at the team. "I think we have been searching for the answer in the wrong place." Everyone looked at him. The experts had spent days studying numbers and reports. Richard had spent only a short time observing. Yet his confidence did not come from guessing. It came from experience that had been built long before many of them had started their careers. And for the first time since the problem began, the Apache seemed less like a mystery and more like a conversation waiting to be understood. The hangar remained unusually quiet after Richard Hayes shared his observation. The experts returned to their screens, reviewing the information once again, but this time their attention had changed. They were no longer simply searching for a technical answer. They were trying to understand how an old veteran with a small toolbox and decades of distance from modern aviation could notice something they had missed. Captain Michael Anderson stood near the Apache, watching the team and watching Richard. He had spent his career trusting preparation, technology, and detailed procedures. Those values had served him well. But now he was facing something different. Richard was not ignoring the technology. He was looking beyond it. The retired aviation specialist asked for a few specific records from the maintenance history. The technicians quickly provided them. Richard studied the documents carefully, comparing old information with the current reports. His fingers moved across the pages slowly, as if he was reading a familiar language. One young technician, named Tyler Brooks, watched with curiosity. Tyler was one of the newest members of the aviation team, highly trained and confident in modern diagnostic systems. He respected Richard, but he still struggled to understand what the veteran was seeing. "How can you know where to look without all the new equipment?" Tyler asked. Richard looked at him and smiled. "Equipment tells you what happened. Experience helps you understand why." The answer stayed with Tyler. It was not a criticism of modern tools. It was a reminder that every piece of technology still depended on the person using it. Richard continued his inspection, asking the team about the aircraft's history. He wanted to know when the Apache first showed signs of difficulty, what conditions surrounded the issue, and what patterns appeared before the problem became noticeable. The questions seemed simple, but they revealed something important. Richard was not searching for a quick solution. He was rebuilding the story of the machine. Captain Anderson noticed the difference. The other specialists had approached the problem like a puzzle. Richard approached it like a conversation. He believed the aircraft was communicating through small details, and his job was to listen. Later that afternoon, Colonel David Mitchell returned to the hangar. He watched Richard work for a moment before approaching Captain Anderson. "Now you understand why I called him," the colonel said quietly. Michael nodded slowly. "He sees things differently." Colonel Mitchell looked at the Apache. He helped train some of the people who built the knowledge we still use today. That statement surprised Michael. He realized Richard Hayes was not simply an old technician from another generation. He was part of the history that created the foundation of modern aviation maintenance. Yet Richard never mentioned his accomplishments. He never asked for recognition. He never tried to prove his importance. He simply focused on the aircraft in front of him. As evening approached, Richard made one more request. He asked the team to review a specific sequence of events from the aircraft's previous maintenance records. The technicians gathered around the information, and for the first time, they began noticing a pattern. It was not obvious. It was not something a computer immediately highlighted. It was a small connection between details that had been sitting in the records all along. Michael looked at Richard with a new level of respect. The old veteran had not replaced modern knowledge. He had added something that technology alone could not provide: experience. And inside the quiet hangar, everyone began to realize that the solution was not hidden in the future. It was waiting in the memory of someone who had never forgotten the past. The next morning at Red Valley Army Aviation Base began with a different atmosphere inside the maintenance hangar. The Apache that had once represented a frustrating mystery now felt like a challenge that the entire team was determined to understand. The technicians gathered around the aircraft with a renewed sense of focus, following the trail of information Richard Hayes had uncovered. Captain Michael Anderson arrived early, expecting to see the same uncertainty that had filled the previous days. Instead, he saw something different. His team was no longer divided between modern technology and old experience. They were working together. Richard stood near the aircraft with his worn toolbox beside him, carefully reviewing the sequence of events from the maintenance records. He did not rush. He did not make dramatic statements. He simply followed the details. Small things often tell the biggest stories, Richard said quietly. The technicians listened closely. One by one, they reviewed the information Richard had requested. A pattern slowly became clearer. A minor change that had seemed unimportant was connected to the larger issue. It was not something the computers had ignored. It was something people had not recognized because they were searching for a major answer. Captain Anderson watched the process carefully. He realized that Richard's greatest skill was not just technical knowledge. It was patience, the ability to notice what others passed by. Tyler Brooks, the young technician who had questioned Richard earlier, now stood closer, taking notes. "How did you learn to see these details?" Tyler asked. Richard looked at the Apache before answering. "Years of working with machines teaches you something. They are built from thousands of parts, but problems usually begin with something small." The simple explanation changed the way Tyler viewed the aircraft. He had spent years learning advanced systems and digital diagnostics. Richard reminded him that technology was a tool, not a replacement for understanding. Later that day, Captain Anderson asked Richard about his time working with Apache aircraft. The veteran paused before answering. "I was part of a generation that learned every sound, every movement, every change. We did not have all the information available today, so we learned to pay attention." Michael looked at the old veteran with curiosity. He had expected stories about achievements and recognition. Instead, Richard spoke about teamwork, responsibility, and the people who stood beside him. That was when Michael understood something important. Richard Hayes was not interested in proving he was better than the younger generation. He wanted to help them become better. As the afternoon continued, the team tested the adjustments based on Richard's observations. Everyone gathered nearby, waiting for the results. The hangar became quiet. Engineers who had once doubted the veteran now watched with respect. The Apache slowly moved from being a problem nobody could explain into a lesson everyone could learn from. When the results confirmed that Richard's understanding had pointed them in the right direction, nobody celebrated loudly. Richard simply nodded and looked at the aircraft. Captain Anderson approached him afterward. "You made this look simple," Michael said. Richard smiled. "No, the answer was always there. We just needed to listen." Those words stayed with the commander. The experts had not failed because they lacked intelligence. They had failed because they were searching from only one perspective. Richard Hayes had brought another. And inside that hangar, a new generation of aviation professionals began to understand that experience was not something left behind in the past. Sometimes, it was the missing piece that connected everything together. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to Red Valley Army Aviation Base. The Apache was no longer just a machine waiting for an answer. It had become a reminder that every challenge could reveal something important when people were willing to look beyond their assumptions. Inside the maintenance hangar, the team continued working alongside Richard Hayes, not because they saw him as someone from the past, but because they recognized the value he brought to the present. Captain Michael Anderson noticed the change immediately. The same technicians who had once questioned why an old veteran was needed were now asking Richard questions, seeking his perspective, and learning from the way he approached problems. Richard never acted like a teacher standing above them. He stood beside them. He shared what he knew and encouraged them to develop their own understanding. One afternoon, Michael walked with Richard around the aircraft and asked about the difference between his generation and the current aviation teams. Richard looked at the Apache and smiled. "The tools have changed," he said, "but the responsibility has always been the same. People depend on these machines, and we have to respect that." The word stayed with Michael because he realized Richard was not talking only about helicopters. He was talking about leadership. The young commander had always believed that strong leadership meant having the right answers. Richard showed him that sometimes leadership meant knowing when to listen. Meanwhile, Tyler Brooks continued spending time with Richard whenever possible. The young technician had entered the hangar believing that experience was something measured by recent certifications and technical knowledge. Now he understood that some lessons could only come from years of dedication. Richard showed him old maintenance notes he had kept from earlier in his career. The pages were worn, the handwriting faded, but every note represented a moment when someone had taken the time to understand a machine instead of simply repairing a problem. "Every aircraft has a history," Richard explained. "If you understand the history, you understand the machine better." For Tyler, those words changed his entire approach. He still valued modern systems and advanced technology, but now he looked at them differently. They were not replacements for human understanding. They were tools that became more powerful when combined with experience. Later that week, Colonel David Mitchell visited the hangar again. He observed the team working together and noticed something beyond the technical progress. The atmosphere had changed. The younger specialists were more patient. The senior members were more open to new ideas. The gap between generations had become a connection instead of a barrier. Colonel Mitchell approached Michael and quietly said, "That is what Richard has always done. He does not just solve problems. He helps people see differently." Michael looked across the hangar at Richard speaking with the technicians. The veteran was not asking for attention. He was not telling stories about his past or reminding anyone of his achievements. He was simply helping the next generation become better. As the sun lowered over the base, the Apache stood ready for the next stage of testing. The aircraft represented more than technology. It represented teamwork, knowledge, and the importance of remembering where lessons come from. Richard Hayes had returned to the place he once knew, but he had not come back to relive the past. He had come back to share it. And slowly, everyone at Red Valley Army Aviation Base began to understand that the greatest experts are not always the ones with the newest tools. Sometimes they are the ones who have spent a lifetime learning how to use them wisely. The morning light spread across Red Valley Army Aviation Base as the Apache prepared for another important stage of evaluation. The atmosphere inside the maintenance hangar had changed completely. What once felt like a place filled with frustration and unanswered questions had become a place of learning, teamwork, and renewed respect. Captain Michael Anderson stood with his team as Richard Hayes reviewed the final details. The old veteran moved with the same calm confidence he had shown since arriving. He did not rush. He did not seek attention. He simply focused on making sure the aircraft and the people working around it were ready. The technicians who had once looked at Richard with uncertainty now listened carefully whenever he spoke. They understood that his knowledge was not a replacement for their training. It was another layer of understanding built from decades of experience. Michael watched this transformation with appreciation. He remembered the first day Richard walked into the hangar carrying a worn toolbox while surrounded by advanced equipment. At that moment, many people saw an old man from another era. Now they saw someone who carried lessons that could not be found in a manual. Before the final evaluation began, Michael approached Richard near the aircraft. "I have been thinking about something," the commander said. "How did you keep learning for so many years?" Richard looked at the Apache and smiled. "You never stop learning. The moment you believe you know everything is the moment you stop improving." The answer stayed with Michael. It was the same principle he wanted his team to understand. Technology would continue to change. New systems would arrive. New generations would take responsibility. But the willingness to learn would always remain important. As the evaluation continued, the team worked together with confidence. Every specialist contributed. Every person understood their role. The Apache represented the success of combined knowledge, not one person standing above everyone else. Richard watched quietly from a distance, satisfied not because people recognized him, but because they understood the lesson behind his return. Later that afternoon, Colonel David Mitchell joined the team for a small gathering near the hangar. He introduced Richard not as a retired specialist, but as someone whose dedication had helped shape the aviation community they continued to build. Richard accepted the recognition with humility. He thanked the team and reminded them that every achievement belonged to everyone who contributed. Machines are important, he said, but the people who care for them are what truly make the difference. Captain Anderson looked around at the younger technicians listening closely. He realized that the greatest change had not happened inside the Apache. It had happened inside the people who worked around it. The experience had taught them patience, respect, and the importance of understanding history. As evening approached, Richard packed his old toolbox. The same toolbox that had seemed ordinary when he arrived now represented something much greater. It represented decades of dedication, countless lessons, and a lifetime of service. Michael walked with him toward the exit of the hangar. "Will we see you again?" the captain asked. Richard smiled. "If the people here keep asking questions, maybe." With those simple words, the veteran left the base. He did not leave behind a speech or a grand announcement. He left behind a different way of seeing problems. And everyone at Red Valley Army Aviation Base understood something they would remember for years. Experience does not become less valuable with time. Sometimes, it becomes the very thing that helps the future move forward. Several weeks had passed since Richard Hayes left Red Valley Army Aviation Base, but the lessons he shared continued to influence everyone who had worked with him. The Apache was no longer remembered as the aircraft that created frustration. Instead, it became a symbol of what could happen when experience and innovation worked together. Captain Michael Anderson noticed the difference every day. The technicians approached their responsibilities with more patience. They asked more questions. They took more time to understand the details instead of searching for the fastest answer. The change was not because they had abandoned modern technology. It was because they had learned how to use it with a deeper understanding. One morning, Michael walked through the maintenance area and saw Tyler Brooks reviewing old maintenance records alongside new digital information. The young technician who once wondered how an older veteran could contribute was now studying the connection between past knowledge and present tools. "You know," Tyler said when Michael approached, "I used to think experience was just knowing old methods. I understand now that it is knowing why those methods mattered." Michael smiled because he recognized the growth in Tyler's words. That was the real impact of Richard Hayes. He had not simply helped them understand an aircraft. He had helped them understand their own approach to learning. Later that month, the base hosted a leadership discussion for aviation personnel. Michael was invited to speak about the experience, but he chose to focus the conversation on the entire team. He explained that solving complex problems was rarely about finding one person with all the answers. It was about creating an environment where different generations could share knowledge. During the discussion, Colonel David Mitchell mentioned Richard's name and asked Michael what stood out most about working with him. Michael paused before answering. The most impressive thing about Richard was not what he knew. It was how willing he was to help others learn. The room became quiet as the officers and technicians considered those words. Many expected stories about remarkable achievements or moments of recognition. Instead, they heard about humility. They heard about a veteran who returned not to prove he was still capable, but to help others become more capable. A few days later, Michael received a letter from Richard. It was a simple handwritten note thanking the team for allowing him to return and share what he had learned throughout his career. At the bottom of the page, Richard included one final message. Never let new technology make you forget the value of understanding. Michael placed the note near his desk where he could see it every day. It became a reminder of the responsibility he carried as a commander. Leadership was not only about making decisions. It was about creating opportunities for people to grow. Months after the Apache situation was resolved, new technicians at Red Valley Army Aviation Base heard stories about Richard Hayes. They did not hear them as stories about an old veteran from another time. They heard them as lessons about dedication, curiosity, and service. The name Richard Hayes represented something larger than one person. It represented the idea that knowledge gained through years of commitment should never be dismissed simply because time has passed. And every time the Apache engines came to life at the base, the people who worked around them remembered the quiet lesson from a veteran who had shown them that true expertise does not disappear. It becomes a foundation for those who come next. The seasons changed at Red Valley Army Aviation Base, but the influence of Richard Hayes remained stronger than anyone expected. What started as a difficult moment for an aviation unit had become a lasting example of how knowledge, respect, and teamwork could transform the way people approach challenges. The Apache that once sat quietly inside the hangar now represented more than advanced engineering. It represented the connection between generations. Captain Michael Anderson continued leading his team with a different mindset. He still valued precision, technology, and preparation, but he also encouraged his people to slow down, ask questions, and learn from every source available. He often remembered something Richard had said during their first meeting. Every machine has a story, and understanding that story requires attention. One afternoon, Michael received an invitation from Colonel David Mitchell to attend a special aviation training event at the base. The purpose was to bring together experienced specialists, young technicians, and new officers to discuss the future of military aviation. Michael immediately knew who should be remembered during the event. Richard Hayes was invited back to Red Valley. When Richard arrived, he received the same simple welcome he always preferred. No large ceremony, no unnecessary attention, just a group of people who appreciated the lessons he had shared. The young technicians who once watched him with uncertainty now greeted him with genuine respect. Tyler Brooks approached him first and thanked him for changing the way he viewed his work. "I used to think experience was about knowing answers," Tyler said. "Now I think it is about knowing the right questions to ask." Richard smiled. "That is how you keep learning." During the event, Michael spoke to the group about leadership. He explained that the most valuable lessons often came from unexpected places. He talked about how easy it was to underestimate someone based on age, appearance, or the tools they carried. But he also explained that true expertise was not defined by how modern something looked. It was defined by dedication, understanding, and the willingness to continue improving. Richard listened quietly from the audience. He never considered himself special. He believed he was simply one person among many who had spent years doing his job and learning from others. After the discussion, several younger service members asked Richard questions about aviation, leadership, and adapting to change. He answered every question with patience. He did not tell them that the past was better than the present. Instead, he explained that every generation had something valuable to contribute. "The future needs new ideas," Richard said. "But new ideas become stronger when they remember what came before." Those words stayed with everyone who heard them. Later that evening, Michael and Richard walked near the edge of the airfield while the sun moved lower across the horizon. The Apache aircraft stood in the distance, reflecting the golden light. Michael looked toward the helicopter and then back at Richard. "You realize you changed this entire unit," he said. Richard shook his head gently. "No, the people here changed themselves. I just reminded them to listen." That answer represented everything about Richard Hayes. He never searched for credit. He never needed recognition to know his service mattered. His greatest achievement was not a title, an award, or a moment in history. It was the knowledge that the people who came after him would carry those lessons forward. And at Red Valley Army Aviation Base, everyone understood that some veterans leave behind more than memories. They leave behind a better way to move into the future. Years passed after Richard Hayes first walked into the maintenance hangar at Red Valley Army Aviation Base, but the lesson from that moment continued to live on through the people who had been there. The Apache that once represented uncertainty became a reminder that every challenge could reveal something valuable when people were willing to look beyond expectations. Captain Michael Anderson continued serving as a leader who valued both innovation and experience. His approach changed in ways that others noticed. He still trusted advanced systems, detailed reports, and modern technology, but he also understood that knowledge could come from many places. The young technicians who worked under him carried that lesson into their own careers. Tyler Brooks became one of the strongest examples of that change. He trained new members of the aviation team and often shared the story of the veteran who showed him that expertise was not measured by age or the newest equipment. It was measured by dedication, curiosity, and the willingness to keep learning. Richard returned to his quiet life away from the base, where he continued spending time with his family, maintaining his small workshop, and enjoying the simple routines he had always valued. He never considered himself a legend. To him, he was simply someone who had spent a lifetime doing his best to serve others. 1 year after the original Apache Challenge, Red Valley hosted a special gathering to recognize the importance of experience within military aviation. Richard was invited once again. This time, he arrived not as someone people questioned, but as someone people respected. Captain Anderson greeted him with a smile and introduced him to a new group of technicians. Many of them had only heard stories about Richard before that day. They expected someone extraordinary. Instead, they found a humble man who listened carefully, answered questions patiently, and treated everyone with the same respect. During the gathering, one young technician asked Richard what advice he would give to people beginning their careers. Richard looked across the room at the next generation of aviation professionals. "Never believe that learning has an expiration date," he said. "The moment you stop listening is the moment you stop growing." The room became quiet as everyone considered his words. Those simple sentences carried the same message Richard had demonstrated from the beginning. True expertise was not about proving that one generation was better than another. It was about building a bridge between what was learned before and what could be achieved next. Later that evening, Michael and Richard stood near the airfield one final time. The Apache aircraft rested under the evening sky, a symbol of progress created through teamwork and understanding. "Do you ever miss being part of it?" Michael asked. Richard looked toward the aircraft and smiled. "I never stopped being part of it. Service is not only where you work, it is what you leave behind." Those words stayed with Michael long after Richard returned home. They became a reminder that the greatest contributions are not always measured by awards, titles, or public recognition. Some people leave their mark through quiet moments, shared knowledge, and the lives they influence. Richard Hayes arrived at Red Valley as a forgotten veteran carrying an old toolbox. He left behind something far more valuable. He left behind a lesson that would continue through every technician, every commander, and every person who understood that experience is not replaced by time. It becomes the foundation that helps others build the future.